The first time I met. I'm grateful that Linden agreed to preach for the first time. I think we met for coffee when y'all were looking for a church. It was just clear that there was a depth of theological reckoning and wrestling and even sort of practical church stuff. You just had so much experience in your life, Linden, I think, with different Christian communities, the good, the bad, the ugly, and and so much evolution in your own faith. And I really respect the way that you think about things, and also just honestly your service of our congregation, specifically through music, but in behind the scenes stuff. Like every time Linden is singing on our worship team, always at the end of the service, they just spontaneously organize all the music for me, which just saves me time. And it's such like a small thing, but I see this embodied in how you do things. So thank you for agreeing to come and preach for us, and feel free to come up now. I'll ask God to bless us through your words, to help us to hear more truth through what you have to say. Is it gonna work? Yeah.
So many papers. I don't even need this. Yeah. I don't know about anybody else. Hi, Barry. I don't know about anybody else, but like masks in summertime. Just their own greenhouse effect on my face. All right. So for those of us who have grown up in the church, this passage is probably quite familiar. I'm sure many of us have seen felt board illustrations. Is that like a visceral memory for anybody other than just me? Like, I wasn't a kid in the church, but I just remember like helping with children's ministry, and like we had this one woman in our church who would always bring her felt board, and every time she showed up, I was like, yes, Becky, yes, bring out the felt board. Or maybe you saw a puppet show about it. I don't know how you do that, but I feel like some creative children's ministry personnel somewhere decided that would be what they did. And then if not, then you've likely heard a sermon about how we need not be anxious for anything, because if God can provide for 5,000 people in the middle of nowhere, then obviously they can provide for you no matter what in your hour of need. And that said, I'm sure we can also all share times when God didn't provide for us, or we didn't feel that provision, or our resources weren't multiplied to the nth degree so that we had 12 baskets of leftovers at the end. And we don't have time today, unfortunately, to dive into all the questions of regarding like the accuracy of storytelling, or I put that in parentheses, reliable narrators, or the like deeper meaning of numbers and whatnot in this passage. And I don't want to brush off those questions as unimportant, because they are very important. But today I want us to kind of look past the miraculous and see the labor that went into making this possible. So as has been discussed, the sermon is part of our ongoing series about Open Way's shared practices, and the shared practice today is service. In case you haven't read the Open Way Google Doc or shared practices Google Doc recently in your casual reading plan, here's what it has to say about service. At Open Way, we believe that each person, without exception, is gifted and equipped in different ways to serve the church and the world. Christians often identify specific spiritual gifts, including those like preaching, teaching, hospitality, mercy, evangelism, healing, leading, and encouraging. You might be gifted in other ways. Maybe you're an excellent musician, or have a sense of humor that lifts people's spirits, or you're good at fixing broken things. We want to be a part of helping you identify the ways you're gifted and helping you find a way to serve the community with those gifts. In this way, we'll become more interdependent, like a body with many parts, each relying on the other for full functioning. Our aim is to use our gifts sustainably, in ways that bring life to others and to ourselves, recognizing that this might mean attending to our capacity and the time and energy resources we have in different seasons of our lives. You might wonder what the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 tells us about service. In order to find out, we're going to disregard the miracle. I know who disregards the miracle in this story, but we are going to, because I want us to be able to see behind it, what is going on in the background of this kind of major event. So to set the scene, the apostles have returned from being sent out in pairs. At their sending out, Jesus gave them, quote, authority over unclean spirits, and charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. Very specific. The apostles have just returned from this time of ministry where our passage for today begins. They have their PowerPoint presentation ready to tell how many demons they cast out and sick people they healed. They're maybe still in their fluorescent t-shirts. And if you don't get that joke, talk to me afterwards. I will explain it. Except they didn't leave the mission field behind. They didn't take an airplane home because there are still people coming up and asking things from them. And Jesus recognizing, y'all have been out for a long time. This is probably tiring, but you're also excited about what's happening. Like, let's go chill for a bit, and you can rest. You can tell me all the things, and it'll be great. So they hop in a boat, and they go to a, quote, desolate location. However, the crowd, clearly seeing them going, maybe it was the fluorescent t-shirts, we don't know, runs around the sea, presumably, and beats them there. Jesus, still recognizing you're tired and wanting to care for his friends, but also greatly moved by the desperation of the people following them, begins to minister to the assembled crowd. Now, if I was one of the apostles, I'd want nothing more than to eat a good meal with my bros, watch probably a couple episodes of Criminal Minds, scare myself a little bit before going to bed and sleeping for a very long time. I don't think I'd be very gracious to Jesus right now. And this is when Tim would be asking me, Tim is my spouse, side note, if you don't know that. Tim would be asking me, do you want everyone to know what you're thinking? Because I have a face that hides nothing. And so if this happened to me, I would be making this face. Just slight disgust, a slight amount of disgust. And so presumably, sometime on into Jesus' ministering, one of the apostles finally speaks up and says to Jesus, hey friend, like, we're gonna have some hangry people on our hands soon, and I don't think we can get Uber Eats out here. Maybe we should send people off to find some food. And Jesus, sassy as ever, responds, and I picture like 3 snaps after this, like, you give them some food kind of thing. Maybe it wasn't that sassy, but I like to picture it that way. And again, if I was an apostle, Tim would be telling me to change my face if I didn't want everyone knowing what I was thinking. And someone, John, tells us in his gospel, in his retelling of this, it was Philip, gives what I imagine is an equally sassy response. Should we go buy food from that invisible vending machine over there with our imaginary savings from our year of work that we just did? Because bear in mind, the disciples just got back from a ministry trip of their own where they were told to take nothing. And so they're feeling the pressure of, where are we going to find food? What are we going to eat? And Jesus, always the man with the plan that no one else seems to know about ever, tells them to see how much food they have at their disposal. And Mark doesn't tell us where the food comes from, but John credits a boy with providing the 5 loaves and 2 fish that end up feeding all these people. When they report back to Jesus with the meager quantities they've tracked down, Jesus instructs them to tell everyone to sit in groups. And this detail to me feels a bit random, but I imagine the implication is that this meal, and actually I really like how the CEB translates it, that it's the, how did they word it? Sorry, I just thought of this today. It's like banquet seating or something, I think they use. And it's this idea that, like, we're gonna eat family style. This isn't going to be like, line up, receive your ration or like your pinch of bread and your little like morsel of fish. Like, this is like, take as much as you want, as many times as you want, pass it along to your neighbor, for them to do the same. And so the 12 disciples coordinate thousands of people into groups. I don't know anybody. Okay, so Beth talks about me organizing music. So Beth, I love you. I love serving this church, but I also organize music because I have some like intense social anxiety, and so I'm always finding things to do. Busy hands, right? And me, again, as an apostle in this situation, I would take that so seriously. I'd be like counting people out, like making sure that we're at the right numbers. Like, just the sheer fact of organizing people alone is intense. So anyways, they coordinate all these people into groups, still not understanding how 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, maybe they're big fish, but they're still only 2, are going to feed everybody. So they return to Jesus, reporting they've got everyone seated. Like, everyone sat down in groups, we're good to go. And Jesus, still only holding 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, blesses them as though this is like a beautiful, immaculate spread. This is a feast before him. And I imagine Jesus splitting the loaves and fish among the disciples. It was a bit like Mary Poppins' bag, if anybody is familiar with Mary Poppins, where it's like, you know, out of Mary Poppins' bag, there's like, she pulls out like a broomstick, and then she like pulls out a whole rocking chair. Maybe she's got like a full wardrobe change, like petticoats and everything. I don't know, you could like pull an elephant out of there. Maybe she needs some entertainment. And so the disciples are handed this, what looks like a pathetic amount of food, and instructed to hand this off to a group of 50 to 100 hangry people. Can you imagine the embarrassment that you would feel as someone hosting these people, walking around these massive circles with not enough food in your hands to satisfy the one person you're handing it to start off with? And yet they do it. They participate in the miracle that they don't yet know is happening, returning to Jesus each time, who seems to always have enough bread and fish to break off another morsel for the next circle of people. And as they walk back through the circles they've already served, they see the chunk of bread and piece of fish making yet another round as people continue to rip pieces off, and pass it to their neighbor. It might not be until after they've served each circle that they realize the miracle, looking back across the field of all those people filling themselves from what seemed like crumbs. And then after all of this, Jesus has the audacity to tell them, go and collect what's left over. Again, this is where Tim would be reminding me, change your face. As a disciple, you breathe a sigh of relief because everyone's been fed. No one's hangry anymore. That's an amazing miracle. Bravo, this is so epic. We love this. And then you have to go up to each group and say, hey, can we have what's left over? Thanks. But they do it. The disciples return to the circles they served, confirm that everyone has had enough to eat. Maybe they like Italian grandma. I said Italian grandma, but I feel like it's every grandma who goes and like, you need to eat more, put some meat on your bones. Like, there's not enough of you here. You turn sideways and I lose you. So maybe they go a little bit like that. And then take back the seemingly unaltered pieces of bread and fish. And I imagine them carrying the pieces back and piling them before Jesus, staring in shock as the pile grows to be 12 times the size it was before they started serving. So there's our miracle. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish feeding thousands of people. But what does this have to do with service? You still ask. And I say, this is where we look past the miracle. I want us to know 2 kinds of people participating in this story. We see the ones serving, or the disciples, and those being served, the people on the grass. We've had a glimpse into those who served, but what about the ones being served? What might their experience be like? Maybe there was a mother there with a child. Well, imagine the kid is around 2 or 3 years old. For anyone who has spent an extended period of time with a hungry, tired toddler, I nod to the parents on this side of the room, especially at an event where they have to be quiet in order for everyone around you to hear, because it's not like Jesus was speaking into a microphone. And they don't have the honorable, the venerable, the amazing, immaculate Miss Rachel to help distract them. This should immediately cause your blood pressure to rise. Don't get me wrong, the mother is thrilled to be there. As a woman, she technically shouldn't even be there learning from a religious leader, uneducated and rebellious as he may be. But she's heard the stories of what he can do. Can you imagine what he has to say? But still, her child is growing restless, antsy, and fidgeting beside her, occasionally maybe playing quietly with other children who have tagged along with their equally rebellious mothers. And as one of the 12 associated with the teacher at the front comes up from behind to interrupt him, the woman's cheeks burn, imagining the shame she would feel interrupting her husband to remind him that they had guests to feed. But part of her feels relief as her own stomach begins to churn. The small snack that maybe she grabbed on her way out of the house as she follows the crowd has long since been distributed, mostly to the children around her, along with whatever meager rations the women around her had brought with them. She's too far away to hear the details of the conversation, but she sees the back and forth between the teacher and his associate. Eventually, the teacher resumes his speech, and while she is enthralled still in what he has to say, the commotion of the associates asking the crowd, starting closest to the teacher, if they have any food to spare doesn't escape her. She has spent years learning the art of subtle hosting, making food appear without anyone seeming to notice. And again, she feels her face flame with empathy for the teacher's associates, begging their guests for provisions. Finally, a young man, no, she sees it's a boy, steps forward with a basket. And it seems he had been sent, probably by his mother, either to receive from or give rations to a neighboring family when he too got swept away in the crowd, bringing the said rations with him. His generosity causes the woman's heart to swell with pride as she reaches down to stroke her child's hair, or imagining that will be them someday, raised to give from what they have, even when it seems meager in comparison. When the associates realize they've found all they will, they return to the teacher, who brings his message to a close and turns his attention away from the crowd to the measly offering. Soon the 12 associates are organizing the large assembly to gather into smaller groups. The woman has no idea how many people are assembled in this pasture land, but the sun slips considerably lower in the sky by the time everyone has been seated in their group. The adults in attendance shift uncomfortably, knowing there is no way that the boy's offering is going to feed everybody, but also not wanting to dishonor their host and their teacher by bringing attention to this. They are all plotting the same thing: take only crumbs to give the illusion of eating, keeping the largest amounts for the children and elderly to hold them over until they can reach relatives or markets later on. One of the associates brings a ration to the woman's group, and it's even smaller than she'd anticipated. Her body tightens as she watches the adults pass the bread and fish one to another, each only taking crumbs. And by the time it gets to her and her child, it has passed through probably 25 hands, but it looks to be the same amount. She takes a crumb of each for herself, quickly tearing off slightly larger bites for her child. She hangs her head to avoid seeing the shame on her host's face when they realize this hasn't been enough to get her even once around the circle. She's shocked when her neighbor hands her the ration once more, making another round around the group. She makes eye contact with the woman offering it, who looks just as shocked as she does. Again, she takes a crumb, offering just slightly more to her child. The ration continues to make its rounds, never changing in size, until finally the children and elderly in attendance deny more, already full. And one by one, the adults in the group begin to tear off larger pieces from the ration until they too are passing it on, denying more and feeling the stretch across their bellies from fullness. The woman stares in astonishment as the associate returns, confirming everyone has had enough, taking back the seemingly unchanged ration, bringing it back to the teacher. And silence falls again upon the crowd as they watch the mound of leftovers grow before him. Soon the mound is a dozen times the size of what the young boy offered. So what does the labor behind the miracle show us about service? We see those serving and we see those being served. We see the labor of getting up, putting in the work, participating in what God is already doing with the resources they've given you. But we also see the labor of slowing down, allowing yourself to be the one served, receiving the gifts and resources of others. Neither of these are necessarily comfortable places to be in all the time. There's often sacrifice to serving and being served. The sacrifice of giving, of time, resources, physical effort, and the sacrifice of taking, humbling oneself to ask, slowing down, receiving the offer. Tim and I are going to be celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary in the fall. And the months leading up to our wedding, I was not doing well mentally. Things were going downhill and getting out of hand pretty fast. And it was clear that therapy would be my best option to get some healthier coping mechanisms in place for my anxiety. At this time, however, Tim was working half-time and studying full-time to finish his thesis for his bachelor's degree, and I was volunteering full-time with a ministry, living on roughly $300 a month. And there was no way we could afford a single therapy lesson our therapy session, let alone enough to be meaningful without being on extensive and lengthy wait lists. And it was Tim's idea to approach our church at the time for finances to be released from their benevolence fund, the purpose of which these were specifically to support people in the community in crisis. And I, on the other hand, was absolutely mortified to be asking this. This was not how I pictured my involvement in church. This is not how I was raised to be involved in church. This was not the question of like, ask not what the church can do for you, but what you can do for the church. But between the money offered by that fund and the lead pastor contributing a decent amount of his personal finances, I was able to access some much needed services. And I've served in the church longer than I've been a part of the church. And I can say being served took way more mental labor on my part than serving. Having to slow down, having to ask for help, and then receiving the resources offered was painstaking. And I'm sure there are many of us here where the case would be similar. Those for whom it's much easier to serve than to be served. But I think we are at our healthiest when we know how to do both, when we can receive service while giving service. And I also know that's easier said than done. We rarely have the capacity for one, let alone both roles at the same time. But a helpful first step might be addressing what we have in excess and what we may be lacking, or what do we have to give versus what do we need to receive. Performing a personal inventory of sorts of our service capacities and needs. For myself in this season, I have to give idle hands, like I said, social anxiety, and also a desire to feed people. And I need to receive community in a relatively new city to me and shared space with good people. So my service right now mainly consists of volunteering in the kitchen of a drop-in shelter once or twice a week. And one evening while I was serving, I had a participant ask why I was there. Why am I giving my time to butter bread and serve pasta? And I didn't have a response right away. But when I thought about it a bit more, I realized that I was serving meals there because there was a collective experience of service for me being there. While I'm serving food and washing dishes, I'm simultaneously being served by the staff and participants around me who are sharing aspects of their days and lives with me. They're sharing stories, they're singing songs to me as I serve. That was incredible. Someone played a ukulele and sang me a song while I served them a meal. And I think I've peaked, guys. Like that's the end for me. Or just reminiscing over the everyday awkwardness of being human, or simply validating my existence, that I'm here, that I'm part of the world, beyond myself and Tim and our cat. And my service in this season isn't one-sided in benefits, and I don't think it needs to be. These personal inventories aren't something that's one and done either. This is something to be revisited from season to season as your resources and capacities change. And sometimes you might be in a position to be serving more than you're being served, but there will be times when it's the other way around, when you're in need of service, when your need for service is higher than your capacity to serve. And it's important to be able to recognize the tides changing in your capacity and to be able to set things down or pass the baton to someone else or ask for help to free up some of your limited resources, or else we're at risk of burning ourselves out. An easy marker, a little plug as well, for when it's time to do a new personal inventory is the volunteer team sign-up sheet that goes out every few months. It's a helpful little reminder if anybody needs it. And while this sermon could have taken the form of challenging us all how we're going to find a place to serve within the church, I don't think that's what we need to hear given our collective track record. However, if you are someone who would like to be serving more and you're struggling to find a place to serve or how to do that within the church, I do recommend chatting with one of our co-pastors. I'm certain they can give you some ideas of what is lacking or where people need to be. But on the whole, Open Way already has a really well-established culture of collective service. Once a week, we receive an email with prayer and service requests and offers. We have volunteer teams that, if I'm not mistaken, are often filled and even have extra people on standby. We're a church built on a foundation of and buoyed by the hospitality of individuals opening their homes for church in the small, and St. Margaret's opening up this space for hybrid church in the large. These are meaningful, real-life aspects of service and something I think we can be proud of. I think where a word of caution emerges for me is in our sustainability, recognizing we are all people who serve, whether in church or outside of it, and this is a church body that cares, and we care deeply, and we care with longevity. And I want to see us continuing to do this. And the only way we can is by evaluating where our service comes from. It's an easy Christian answer to say that our service comes from a love of God and a love for our neighbor. And as Joy mentioned in her interview, I'm sure there are quite a few of us here who, like me, were taken advantage of by this answer. Maybe you were voluntold, or to use a heavier word, coerced, into doing more than we had capacity for. I know I'm not the only one who stumbled to open ways doors, tired and burnt out. Love in English is a really broad term. It can mean anything from caring about a stranger's well-being to romantic intimacy with a partner, to very different feelings marked by the exact same word. But defining love for God and neighbor more specifically, or by defining that, I think we can better care for ourselves and each other. So how do we go about actually defining the word from which we draw to serve? I recently read a collection of essays called Thunder Song, written by Sasha Takshablu-LaPointe, which I would 100% recommend, especially to anyone non-Indigenous. Cherry, it's so good. LaPointe is a Coast Salish author from the Nooksack and Upper Skagit Indian tribes. Note, I'm using Indian only because those are the officially recognized names. And ʔuʔušəbicid is the ancestral language of the Upper Skagit people. LaPointe describes a ʔuʔušəbicid term that I think can help us begin to determine the kind of foundation we aim to serve from. The caveat before I share this is I want to recognize I am a white settler and therefore want to be really careful with how I talk about borrowing this term from ʔuʔušəbicid speakers. It's critical for me to acknowledge that it's because of people like me and my ancestors coming to this land uninvited by the hosts of this place that has created the conditions for ʔuʔušəbicid to become an endangered language. And so I note this so as not to disbody the term from the language community and the implications that it has for ʔuʔušəbicid speakers, especially as has been shared by LaPointe. But in her essay titled ʔuʔušəbicid, an Indigenous queer love story, LaPointe describes being introduced to the ʔuʔušəbicid phrase ʔuʔušəbicid, which she assumes to mean I love you. However, she comes to learn that its meaning is much more complex. ʔuʔušəbicid, which I last minute borrowed for the title of this sermon, means I have unconditional love for you. I have compassion for you. To quote LaPointe, ʔuʔušəbicid spoke of a love that transcended romantic love, a love that reached beyond want and desire. This love was about compassion, a love that comes without resources and ownership, a love that reminds us we are worthy of care and affection, no matter the container. It's a love that extends to compassion and care. If we look back at our passage to verse 34, it describes Jesus' feeling towards the gathered crowd as compassion. We could borrow from LaPointe and say Jesus' thoughts towards the crowd may have been similar to ʔuʔušəbicid. Despite being exhausted from their sending out, the disciples chose to participate in Jesus' compassion and unconditional love for the gathered crowd. They chose to echo ʔuʔušəbicid alongside their Messiah. And from that foundation, they participated with what God was doing with the resources they had available to serve the crowd before them. And the mother in the crowd, she put in the labor of receiving ʔuʔušəbicid, receiving the Messiah's compassionate, unconditional love, echoed by those serving her. So my hope for our community, as we continue to lean into our shared practice of service, is that like the disciples, we find our sustainability to serve from a God-given compassion and unconditional love, and that we can find our personal and seasonal balances between serving and being served, recognizing and honoring both our echoes of ʔuʔušəbicid towards our neighbors, and when our neighbors turn back to us to respond, ʔuʔušəbicid, for we too are worthy of compassion and unconditional love.